Right now, somewhere on your property, there is a plant growing that you have probably pulled out dozens of times without a second thought. It shows up in the cracks of your driveway. It creeps along the edges of your garden beds. It pushes through gravel and concrete like it owns the place. And every summer, without fail, it comes back. Most people reach for the herbicide. Some just yank it out by hand. A few people have spent real money trying to get rid of it permanently. Here is what makes that interesting. Americans spend over $2 billion every single year on omega-3 supplements, fish oil capsules, krill oil soft gels, algae-based tablets in recycled packaging, all of it purchased at the pharmacy, the health food store, or ordered online and delivered to the door. And the plant growing uninvited in your backyard right now contains more omega-3 per ounce than most of those products sitting on your shelf. That is not an exaggeration. That is what the science actually shows. The United States spends more on healthcare than any country on Earth, more than $15,000 per person per year. And yet, 6 out of every 10 American adults are living with at least one chronic condition. Something about that math does not add up. And when something does not add up, it is worth asking what part of the picture we might be missing. This video is about one very specific piece of that picture. A plant called purslane that grows in all 50 states, costs nothing to obtain, and has a history that stretches back 4,000 years across dozens of civilizations. Today we are going to look at why this plant disappeared from the American table, what the science actually says about what it contains, and what a small island in Greece has to do with one of the most interesting nutritional puzzles of the last century. If you have ever felt like the health system was selling you solutions to problems it helped create, you are going to want to stay until the end. And if this kind of content speaks to you, hitting subscribe means you will not miss what comes next. There is something quietly strange about the way Americans relate to their lawns and gardens. Drive through any suburb on a Saturday morning, and you will see the same ritual playing out on street after street. Someone kneeling in the dirt, pulling things out. Someone else spraying the edges of a driveway with a bottle of herbicide. Bags of pulled weeds lined up at the curb. Hours of effort. Real money spent. And the target of all that effort is almost always the same category of plant. The ones that nobody planted. The ones that showed up on their own. The ones that, by definition, must be removed. But here is the question that almost nobody stops to ask. Who decided what counted as a weed? And more importantly, who benefited from that decision? The herbicide industry in the United States is worth tens of billions of dollars. Products designed to kill unwanted plants line entire aisles at hardware stores. Roundup alone became one of the best-selling chemical products in American history, built almost entirely on the idea that what grows without permission has no value. That narrative, the idea that uninvited plants are by nature inferior or dangerous, did not emerge from science. It emerged from commerce. And it was reinforced so consistently, through advertising, through suburban lawn culture, through the quiet pressure of neighborhood aesthetics, that most Americans absorbed it without ever questioning it. Purslane did not stand a chance inside that story. It grows low to the ground, spreading outward in thick reddish stems. The leaves are small, fleshy, almost succulent looking. It appears in gardens without being invited, and spreads quickly once it finds good soil and sunlight. By every measure that American lawn culture uses to define a weed, purslane checks every box. It was not planted intentionally. It cannot be controlled easily. It competes with the things people actually want it to grow. And so, generation after generation of American gardeners learned to pull it, spray it, and bag it without ever once wondering what it actually was. Here is what makes that worth pausing on. The average American household spends somewhere between $40 and $80 every single month on omega-3 supplements. That is nearly $1,000 a year, spent on capsules that have to be manufactured, bottled, marketed, shipped across the country, stocked on shelves, and then purchased. And the plant delivering those same essential fatty acids in a natural whole food form was sitting in the backyard getting pulled out with the rest of the so-called weeds. Nobody told us. That is the important thing to hold on to. This is not a story about personal failure or ignorance. It is a story about what happens when the value of something cannot be captured by a price tag. Purslane cannot be patented. It cannot be branded. There is no version of purslane that a company can own, package, and sell with a premium markup while competitors are locked out of the market. It simply grows. Freely. Abundantly. In all 50 states. In almost every climate. Without irrigation, without fertilizer, without any human assistance whatsoever. And in a culture that has come to believe that value lives on store shelves, something that refuses to be sold becomes easy to dismiss. Not because it lacks worth, but because worth, in the modern American marketplace, is so often measured by what something costs rather than what it actually does. What this plant actually does, and what it has been doing for thousands of years across dozens of civilizations, is a story that starts much further back than most people realize. Further back than the supplement industry. Further back than the American suburb. Further back, even, than the country itself. And the first stop on that journey might surprise you, because it involves a president, a garden in Virginia, and a plant that Thomas Jefferson grew on purpose. In the early 1980s, a team of archaeologists working in what is now modern-day Iraq cracked open a series of ancient clay jars that had been buried in the earth for roughly 4,000 years. Inside those jars, preserved in the dry heat of the region, were thousands of tiny black seeds. The researchers knew immediately that these seeds had not ended up there by accident. They had been gathered, sorted, and stored with intention. Someone had looked at this plant, understood its value, and made a deliberate decision to save it for the future. Those seeds belonged to purslane, and that moment, sealed in clay jars along the banks of the ancient Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is where this story truly begins. Because 4,000 years ago, nobody called it a weed. In ancient Mesopotamia, in what historians consider the very cradle of human civilization, purslane was not something that got pulled out of the garden. It was something that got planted into the garden. It appeared in agricultural records alongside other intentional crops. It was described in writings about food, about seasonal harvesting, about the rhythms of daily life. It was, in the plainest possible terms, groceries. Not a curiosity. Not a remedy reserved for special occasions. Everyday food, grown and eaten by ordinary people the way Americans today might grow tomatoes or herbs. From that starting point, purslane followed human civilization almost everywhere it went. When ancient Greek and Roman traders and soldiers moved across 3 continents, purslane moved with them. Not as a contaminant or an accidental passenger, but as a cultivated plant that people brought intentionally because they knew what it offered. Theophrastus, one of the earliest naturalists in recorded history, documented purslane not as a weed to be managed, but as a meaningful crop worthy of study. The Romans grew it. The Persians ate it. Communities across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe all arrived at the same conclusion independently. This plant feeds people well. And when civilizations that had never been in contact with each other all arrive at the same answer, that answer deserves serious attention. Now here is where the story takes a turn that hits closer to home. Long before European settlers crossed the Atlantic, purslane was already in North America. Archaeological excavations in Kentucky have turned up purslane seeds dating back approximately 8,000 years. Other sites across the continent confirm that indigenous communities were cultivating and consuming purslane as part of their regular diet, sometimes growing it alongside corn and squash, the staple crops at the heart of native agricultural systems. Purslane did not arrive with Columbus. It was already here, already known, already being used by people who understood its value long before anyone else thought to question it. And then there is the detail that tends to stop American audiences cold when they hear it for the first time. Thomas Jefferson grew purslane at Monticello. Not by accident. and not as some kind of botanical experiment. It appeared in his garden records as an intentional planting, listed among the things he wanted to cultivate and eat. The man who wrote that all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights understood something about purslane that the modern American homeowner, kneeling in the garden with a bag and a trowel, has completely forgotten. So what happened? How does a plant go from clay jars in ancient Mesopotamia to Jefferson's personal garden in Virginia to the weed pile at the end of your driveway? The answer is not dramatic. It did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, across the 20th century, as American food culture became increasingly organized around what could be grown at industrial scale, packaged for mass distribution, and sold with a profit margin attached. If a plant could not be owned, it lost its place in the story. And purslane, which grows freely and refuses to be controlled, simply got written out. But the science never forgot. And what researchers eventually uncovered about this plant, starting with a puzzle on a small Mediterranean island that had scientists scratching their heads for decades, is what makes this story something more than just history. In the 1950s, a physiologist named Ansel Keys set out to solve what he believed was one of the most important puzzles in modern medicine. Heart disease was rising across the Western world, and nobody could explain exactly why. Keys believed the answer was hiding somewhere in the data, if you looked at enough countries, tracked enough people, and followed them long enough. So he launched what became known as the 7 Countries Study, one of the most ambitious nutritional research projects ever attempted at that time. Thousands of men across multiple nations tracked over decades, their diets and their deaths mapped against each other in search of a pattern. The goal was simple: find the common thread, pull it, and maybe save some lives in the process. The early results seemed to tell a clean story. Countries where people ate more saturated fat had higher rates of heart disease. Countries where they ate less seemed to fare better. It was the kind of finding that translated easily into policy, into newspaper headlines, into the kind of advice that doctors could hand to patients in 30 seconds or less. Eat less fat. Protect your heart. The message spread quickly, and for a generation of Americans, fat became the enemy at the dinner table. But then there was the island of Crete. And Crete refused to cooperate with the clean story. The people of Crete were not eating a low-fat diet. By the standards of the study, they were eating quite a lot of fat, much of it from olive oil, lamb, and dairy products. They were not counting calories or following any kind of structured health program. They were simply eating the way their grandparents had eaten, and the way their grandparents before them had eaten, going back further than anyone could easily trace. And yet, when the data came in, the people of Crete had some of the lowest rates of heart disease of any population in the entire study. Lower than Japan. Lower than countries with far more restricted diets. Lower, in some categories, than researchers had even thought possible, given what these people were consuming. The scientific community gave this phenomenon a beautiful name. They called it the Mediterranean diet, wrapped it in imagery of olive groves and seaside villages, and attributed it to a kind of lifestyle that was rich, unhurried, and deeply rooted in tradition. It was a satisfying explanation. It was also incomplete. Because when researchers went back years later and analyzed blood samples that had been preserved from those original Cretan study participants, they found something that the original analysis had not focused on. The Omega-3 levels in these people were remarkably high. Not just higher than expected, higher than populations that were eating significantly more fish, higher than almost any comparable group in the study. And the question that followed from that finding was one that nobody had a ready answer for. If these people were not eating dramatically more fish than everyone else, where was all that Omega-3 coming from? The answer was sitting on their plates every single day, so ordinary and so unremarkable that researchers had not thought to measure it carefully. Purslane. The people of Crete ate it raw in salads, wilted with olive oil and garlic, stirred into cooked dishes, and served alongside almost every meal. They also fed it to their chickens and their goats, which meant the eggs and the meats that came from those animals carried elevated omega-3 levels as well. The nutrition was moving through the entire food system, quietly and consistently, because one plant that everyone recognized as ordinary food was woven into daily life at every level. A researcher named Artemis Simopoulos was among the first to analyze purslane systematically and publish the findings in a way that the scientific community could not easily dismiss. The numbers were striking. Purslane contains more alpha-linolenic acid, which is the plant-based form of omega-3, than any other leafy green vegetable ever formally analyzed. More than spinach, more than kale, more than the mixed salad greens sold in every grocery store in America at a price that makes them feel like a health investment. It also delivers meaningful amounts of vitamin E, vitamin C, beta-carotene, magnesium, and potassium. When you read through the full nutritional profile, it starts to feel less like a weed and more like something that a team of scientists designed in a laboratory specifically to support human health and then somehow forgot to package. The clinical research that followed added another layer. A landmark study known as the Lion Diet Heart Study enrolled patients who had already experienced a heart attack and divided them into two groups. One group followed the standard dietary advice being given to heart patients at that time. The other group followed a diet rich in omega-3 sources, including traditional plants like purslane prepared in the Mediterranean style. The results were significant enough that the researchers made the unusual decision to stop the study early. Not because it had failed, because the gap between the two groups had become wide enough that continuing to keep one group on the standard diet felt ethically difficult to justify. That is the kind of outcome that does not get a lot of attention in mainstream media. But it is exactly the kind of outcome that changes how a scientist thinks about what food can actually do. None of this means purslane is a cure for anything. That is not the claim being made here, and it would not be an honest claim to make. What the science does suggest is that when a population eats a diet that includes this plant regularly, as part of a broader pattern of whole foods and traditional cooking, something measurable and meaningful happens to the nutritional profile of that diet. The omega-3 balance shifts. The inflammatory load changes. And populations that have been doing this for generations show outcomes that researchers with sophisticated equipment and careful methodology are still working to fully explain. The science is pointing somewhere. And what it is pointing toward has been growing in American backyards, untouched and unrecognized, for the entire time that scientists have been trying to figure out why the people of Crete live so well. So now we know the history. We know the science. We know that purslane fed ancient civilizations, that Thomas Jefferson grew it on purpose, that the people of Crete were quietly consuming it every day while researchers were puzzling over why they lived so well. But there is still one question sitting underneath all of this that has not been fully answered. If this plant is so nutritious, so abundant, so historically significant, and so scientifically interesting, why is it still being treated as a nuisance in the country that spends more on health and wellness than anywhere else on Earth? The answer has almost nothing to do with the plant itself. It has everything to do with what the plant refuses to be. In 2022, a research team at Yale University published findings from a detailed genetic analysis of purslane that stopped plant biologists in their tracks. What they discovered was that purslane does something at the cellular level that scientists had long considered essentially impossible in a single plant. Most plants use one of a few different photosynthesis systems depending on their environment. Some are efficient in mild, temperate conditions. Others, like corn and sugarcane, are built for heat and perform well in high temperatures. And then there are plants like cacti that have developed a completely different survival strategy, one where they close their pores during the day to conserve water and only open them at night to take in carbon dioxide, essentially going into a kind of low-power mode to survive drought. Each of these systems involves real trade-offs. The drought survival strategy keeps the plant alive but slows its growth considerably. No plant was thought to run all of these systems simultaneously because the biological demands seemed fundamentally incompatible. Purslane does exactly that. The Yale team found that purslane activates its heat-efficient daytime system to grow rapidly in full sun, while simultaneously running its drought survival system within the same cells at the same time, using carbon captured overnight to fuel the next day's growth. It is the biological equivalent of a vehicle that runs on gasoline, electric power, and solar energy all at once, switching seamlessly between them based on conditions, without losing efficiency in any mode. The researchers described it as one of the most unusual and sophisticated combinations ever observed in plant biology. Not unusual in the sense of rare and fragile. Unusual in the sense that it should not work as well as it does, and yet it works extraordinarily well. This is why purslane thrives in cracked asphalt and dry gravel and compacted soil that would kill most cultivated plants within days. It is not surviving in those conditions despite its biology. It is thriving because of it. A single plant can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds. Those seeds remain viable in the soil for decades. And if you break off a stem and leave it lying on bare ground, it will root itself and begin growing again as a new plant. Complete removal is nearly impossible, which is precisely why gardeners find it so frustrating, and precisely why it has outlasted every attempt to erase it. And here is the part that ties everything together. Purslane cannot be patented. There is no seed company that owns the rights to it. There is no licensing agreement required to grow it. No subscription, no annual purchase, no premium formulation that outperforms the original. It simply exists, freely and abundantly, in a form that nature developed over thousands of years and that no commercial interest can replicate, improve upon, or monopolize. In an economy built around the idea that value flows from ownership and scarcity, a plant that is impossibly resilient and freely available to everyone represents something genuinely uncomfortable for industries built on selling you the nutrients it contains for free. The Omega-3 supplement market in the United States is worth more than $2 billion annually and growing. That market depends, at least in part, on the widespread belief that these nutrients are difficult to obtain without purchasing a product. Purslane does not fit inside that belief. It never did. And the simplest explanation for why it disappeared from the American table is not that people stopped finding it useful. It is that something that cannot be sold is very easy to stop talking about. The good news is that what was forgotten can be remembered. And remembering, it turns out to be much easier than most people expect. Take a moment and think about everything this one small plant has been through. It sat in clay jars buried in ancient Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, saved by people who understood its value well enough to preserve it for the future. It traveled across 3 continents, carried intentionally by civilizations that recognized it as food worth keeping. It grew in Thomas Jefferson's garden at Monticello, planted by hand by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. It fed generations of people on a small Greek island whose health outcomes baffled researchers for decades. It survived being analyzed by some of the most sophisticated genetic equipment available to modern science. And what that equipment revealed was that this plant operates at a biological level that should not even be possible. And through all of that, through every empire and every era and every wave of agricultural change, it kept growing. Quietly, persistently, in the cracks and the margins and the overlooked corners of the world, waiting for someone to look down and actually see it. Now here is the practical part, because information without application is just entertainment. Purslane is one of the easiest plants in North America to identify once you know what you are looking for. It grows low to the ground, spreading outward rather than upward. The stems are thick and slightly reddish, almost succulent in texture. The leaves are small, smooth, and paddle-shaped, with a fleshy quality that makes them feel different from most common garden plants. In the summer months, tiny yellow flowers appear in the morning and close by midday. If you press a stem between your fingers, it feels almost watery inside, which reflects the plant's remarkable ability to store moisture even in dry conditions. You will find it in garden beds, in sidewalk cracks, along the edges of driveways, and in any patch of soil that gets full sun. Once you recognize it, you will start seeing it everywhere, because it has been everywhere all along. The simplest way to start is to eat it raw. Add it to a salad the way you might add spinach or arugula. It has a mild, slightly tangy flavor with a pleasant crunch from the stems. If you prefer it cooked, a quick sauté with olive oil and a little garlic is all it needs. It wilts like any leafy green and takes on a soft, satisfying texture that works well alongside eggs, beans, or grilled vegetables. You do not need a recipe. You do not need a special preparation. You just need to stop throwing it away. If someone in your life is spending real money every month on supplements while this plant is growing uninvited in their backyard, share this video with them. Not because it will solve everything, but because sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do for someone is hand them a piece of information that changes how they see something ordinary. And if this kind of content speaks to you, the kind that goes looking for what has been overlooked and asks why it was forgotten in the first place, then subscribing means you will be here for what comes next. Purslane did not survive 4,000 years of history by being fragile. It survived by being exactly what it is: quietly essential, impossible to erase, and always there in the margins, waiting for someone to finally stop walking past it.